Today we're continuing on our journey through the suttas, and the sutta that we'll be covering today will be in many ways a continuation of the one we did last couple of weeks ago and the week prior, meaning the Dhammacakkappavattana. So this would be the Anattalakkhaṇa Sutta, the discourse on the nature of non-substantiality, typically or usually translated as the teachings on non-self. Many people have come to Buddhism because of this. It's intriguing for many. The non-self, the no-self. And that is not necessarily a correct translation of no-self. So, but before we dig into the various aspects of it, I just want to give some of the logistical data on it. So it is it comes from the connected discourses or linked discourses, and this happens to be Sutta number 22.89. And it is from the Khanda Saṁyutta, or the collection on the aggregates, from the Upayavagga, or the group on engagement. Again, the sutta itself is called Anattalakkhaṇa Sutta in Pali, discourse on the nature of non-substantiality. That's how I like to translate it, instead of using the typical, usual definition. This fits better, to my understanding, non-substantial, the lack of an essence, a living soul within, if you will, in beings. So if you recall from the last sutta that we were covering together, initially we find 4 suttas. Typically they are recognized as 3, the original foundational suttas, if you will, of the sasana, of Lord Buddha's dispensation. The first one being Dhammachakkappavattana, which is the discourse on setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion. The second one is this, often used as the discourse that was given right after it's not necessarily right after. It took about 5 days. In fact, there's a 5 days gap between the first one and this Anattalakkhaṇa Sutta. And then we have the Aditya Pariyaya Sutta, commonly used as the fire sermon that Lord Buddha gave to 1,000 bhikkhus. But there's one sutta that's often neglected to be included in these primary. In fact, it comes right between the Dhammacakkappavattana and the Anattalakkhaṇa, and that is the Hemavata Sutta. And that is a sutta that was not given to human beings, which we will also cover. So these are recognized to be not only the earliest suttas, but also historically very much related in both their timeline and importance to each other, because they complement each other beautifully, and gives us a lovely backdrop, an understanding of also what was taking place, instead of just picking out these events that took place in the Buddha's life, in the lives of the students. So it's good sometimes to have a temporal, a timeline, if you will, a timeline of things and how things unfolded. So this is a very important sutta, and we will discover as to why. But before we jump in, because it builds on the previous sutta we talked about, setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion, the Dhammacakkappavattana. So just to recap what that sutta was, the primary major points, we saw how Lord Buddha was teaching us to avoid the two extremes of sensual indulgence and also extreme asceticism, or self-mortification, as he delineated the middle path, which is the second key point of the Dhammacakkappavattana, the middle path, which he also alternated with, it's the same definition in a sense as the Noble Eightfold Path, which takes us to point 3, and that is the sharing, the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. That's the third key part of the sutta that we covered. And to bring more of a humanity, or more of a relatedness rather, in the sutta itself, the connection that we see in Venerable Kondanya's awakening, which is point number 4. And that is where he had the eye of Dhamma arise in him. And sometimes people get confused between the eye of Dhamma and the divine eye. These are two completely different things. They're not the same. And one, of course, the Dhamma eye is something that happens to an individual who has become a Sotapanna, has entered the path of Sotapatti, meaning became a stream enterer or stream winner. Which changes there. It's an unprecedented level of understanding, of a lack of doubt towards the teaching, towards the teacher, and towards the possibility of awakening for oneself. Whereas the divine eye is the ability to basically break the our understanding of physics, normal physics, because it goes beyond the confines of time and space, gives the person who has that, it's a psychic ability. Usually Venerable Anuruddha comes to mind from Buddhist history. He was notable, even recognized by Lord Buddha as having the divine eye. So a person does not need to have the divine eye in order for them to experience the Dhamma eye, if that were a question that might come up. So the Dhamma eye has everything to do with a level of understanding that changes the person's position in life, understanding, especially in connection to the Triple Gem. And the level of sila rises to unprecedented levels within the individual. Virtue becomes a huge thing. So basically, coming back to Venerable Kondanya, we saw how he was the first to attain the stage of Sotapanna, and he immediately after requested Lord Buddha to obtain the Upasampada, the higher ordination of becoming a full-on bhikkhu. We have two ordinations, roughly speaking, and Pabbaja and Upasampada, and one is a novice training, and the other one is the ordination of a bhikkhu. And so he becomes ordained as a bhikkhu. And next in line, we have Vappa and Bhaddiya, the other two of the four left, who were not yet attained the state of Sotapatti. And each one of these individuals, all four, they get to experience what Venerable Kondanya did experience each of those days, so consecutively. So Venerable Vappa becomes a Sotapanna, the following day after Venerable Kondanya. Next is Venerable Bhaddiya. And the following day we have Venerable Mahanama. And then the fourth day we have Venerable Assaji. And each of them, after they attain the stage of stream winning, they immediately ask for ordination. And in those days, Lord Buddha didn't go through the elaborate initiation process. He would just say, "Ehi bhikkave, come bhikkhus," and that was the ordination. That was it. Plus, these were individuals who had spent years training and disciplining themselves. And so there was no doubt in Lord Buddha's mind as to their ability and desire to pursue and persevere on the path. An interesting backstory to this would also necessitate us dwelling on a little bit on the fact that while there were students being instructed, guided by Lord Buddha, they were kept close by. Neither Lord Buddha nor those students in question who hadn't yet attained the level of Sotapatti did go to Pindapada. So they didn't go for alms round. Lord Buddha really kept them close, so he constantly was working with them, day and night, day and night, day and night. While the other, starting with Venerable Kondanya and then Vappa and Bhaddiya, they were the ones who were going and getting food for the rest of the bhikkhus, including Lord Buddha's. So I found that to be very beautiful. The camaraderie, the support, and the love for each other. And of course, the love and compassion of Lord Buddha towards the students, to just making sure that they're given all the right conditions to support awakening to happen. Now, as far as the awakening, sometimes people say, well, I just have to listen to the suttas or read the suttas and I'll get it. Look at the group of five bhikkhus. They were able to become sotapannas. Not exactly. It wasn't just purely listening and that's it. These were practitioners. They knew the meaning of aditthana, which is determination or heedfulness. Some of us can't sit for 10 minutes without drooping, without sleeping, without dozing off. Well, aditthana has to be there throughout our journey, including, by the way, while we listen to a sutta or an exploration of a sutta like this one. So the meditation practice has to be there in one form or another to allow samadhi to take place. So I need you to also look at it in that fashion, because I've come across individuals in my journeys through the Dhamma and continents where they said, well, we don't have to try. We're already there. I'm already there. You know, that's what this teacher teaches and this. And some of these individuals who've mentioned these things that are completely based on wrong view were even in robes. So we have to be very, very careful. There is a balance. Remember, the Dhammacakkappavattana was all about the middle path. Because on the other extreme, you have individuals who talk about the Abhidhamma. You have to understand the Abhidhamma fully. You have to know the Visuddhi Magga fully. That is the core. So, and they make it so incredibly difficult to even fathom as to the work that needs to be done by the individual. That's another extreme. Lord Buddha said, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Very simple structure for us to be reminded of. So, I just wanted to give that as the background as we begin. So this is happening 5 days, and all the five students are bhikkhus, ordained, and they all have seen the Dhamma. They have the Dhamma eye. This is the 5th day following the Dhammacakkappavattana discourse. This is what I personally heard. Once, the Blessed One was living at Varanasi's deer park in Isipatana. It was then that the Blessed One addressed the group of 5 bhikkhus in this manner and said the following: Bhikkhus, yes, Bhante, they all replied. And the Blessed One continued: Bhikkhus, form in its essence is non-substantial. Because if form were to have a substantiality to it, then it would not disintegrate or fall apart, where one could even be driven to say, may my form be this way or that, substantial and unchanging. Quickly we see how Lord Buddha is jumping in to dismantle the person through looking at the 5 Kkhandas. So we start with the form. He's not wasting any time. Form. And basically the aggregates, and specifically starting with the most obvious, the visible, the shape of the being. And in doing so, he will unravel by demonstrating the 3 signatas, or the 3 characteristics of existence, namely anicca, which is the impermanence, dukkha, which is the suffering or dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness, the sense of always lacking, and anatta, which is the non-substantiality. But bhikkhus, because form in its essence is non-substantial, it does disintegrate and fall apart, where one could not be able to say, may my form be this way or that, substantial or unchanging. We can especially see the relevancy of this when we do, for example, the 32 parts of the body contemplation. When we look at, for example, kesa, loma, nakha, danta, tacho, head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, and skin or body. Obviously, there's the others as well, but these are the, I've gone over these before, but these are the best, most related, or relatable rather, things about ourselves that we can see that they are anicca, impermanent, they are suffering, and they are non-substantial. For example, when you're combing your hair, if you have any, you're doing all the work, going to the hairdresser, this and that. Oh, I need it to be this shape, this style. I need to put some gel, this and that. So there's an effort to gain some pleasure out of it. Or the nails, working on the nails, etc. But what happens when the hairdresser, the stylist, or the barber goes ahead and does snip, snip, and a portion of the hair falls off into the ground? And we look at the floor where that hair used to be, well, it used to be up here, now it's down there. What we are immediately full of at that time, at that moment, in witnessing the hair, strands of hair cut, immediately as something separate from us. In fact, we are filled with disgust. The same hair that earlier was on our head. Or if a strand of hair just falls into the meal that we're having. Ooh, that's a fun one, isn't it? All of a sudden you're like, oh. What happened? Well, we saw all 3 characteristics in one shot. If there is the awareness and the understanding to observe these things, these phenomena, which often go unnoticed. Hence, we need to practice sati and sampajanya, mindfulness and clearly comprehending what is my involvement here. The hair was on my head, now it's on the floor. So it's a matter of distance? Is that it? Or is it more than that? My contribution, my identification with this thing now, which I call not part of me. In fact, the hair, you could do whatever to it, or the same with the nail that has come away from your finger. You cut it, you don't go screaming because it doesn't have any living cells in it. But we still find it to be part of us, ourselves, me. This is me. You and I are the same thing. That is delusion. And that is what Lord Buddha is trying to dismantle. He is trying to have the student tear this sense of identification between the aggregates. So the identification, the glue, the gorilla glue comes off. And you see things as they are. Now, conventionally, of course, the person is there. That's why I don't 100% agree with people who say non-self, because obviously we use like myself, this and that. Conventionally, we know that. But to go ahead and just wholesale just say there is no self, that can create more confusion than wisdom in people. So, of course, this the same mechanism applies to all 32 parts of the body. So, like a perfect example is a person who's had amputation of some sort, or a major injury where they've lost an eye, for example, or a finger, or doctors had to remove a portion of their body. Well, how do they look at that body part over there on the table, separate from them? There's no way to connect the two anymore. Where is the sense of I at that moment? And do I stop living, or do I start living in two places at the same time? With my nail or my arm that's over there that is totally useless now because of cancer, for example, in this body. So we see how when we probe into it, it falls apart. Continuing, bhikkhus, feeling. So this is the second of the aggregates. Feeling in its essence is non-substantial, because if feeling were to have a substantiality to it, then it would not disintegrate or fall apart, where one could even be driven to say, may my feeling be this way or that, substantial and unchanging. But bhikkhus, because feeling in its essence is not substantial, it does disintegrate and fall apart, where one could not be able to say, may my feeling be this way or that, substantial or unchanging. We want to have a certain type of feeling, but during the day, we go through countless states of feelings. Even when we're very happy, let's say, or in a very pleasant mood, something happens out of the blue, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in the dark emotionally. We are upset because we saw the neighbor do something. What happened? Where did that feeling go? Even though I wanted to grab onto it, put it in a barrel of concrete and just don't move, stay there. That doesn't work. So long as we have these six sense doors, they're always flowing in with data. And so long as there is no sati to keep guard at these doors, to practice some restraint at least, we're always susceptible to feelings. And there are feelings that will come up because of sankharas. They will come up. Now, just like form that goes through its own motions, feelings go through their own motions. Again, am I my feelings would be another way of looking at this. So in order for something to have a self, therefore, it needs to be unchanging. Just when we ponder this logically, because it needs to be fixed. It needs to definitely come under our control. And there is no such thing. And yeah, it needs to be self-sustaining, and it needs to be self-sustained. Self-determined is another way of looking at it. And under all circumstances and conditions. But we see that our feelings, just like our forms, are in fact not self-contained. They're always subject to some series of causes and conditions that put them back again into the characteristics of existence, specifically with anicca. And anything that is anicca, anything that is impermanent, sooner or later brings us the sense of lack or dukkha. And we have countless examples in the suttas where individuals come to Lord Buddha kind of wanting to debate with him on this. How could you say there is no soul? Because we say anatta, but it comes from the Sanskrit word for it, atman. Atman or atta is the same thing. So all the philosophical schools, in one way or another, including Jainism, they have this conviction, and not just in India, by the way, all around the world, all ways of thinking. When we look carefully, deeply, we see that there is this either subtle or gross acceptance of a soul or a jiva, in case of Jainism. And this is what usually is considered like the hub, the vortex, the center of one's belief system, one's understanding of life even. So you had a lot of people who came to Lord Buddha trying to negate, trying to debate with him, to prove him wrong. And Lord Buddha has used meticulously so many metaphors and analogies and similes to demonstrate this. And one that really comes to mind very quickly is when many philosophers came to debate with him, and in one particular case, he uses the example of the king, the ruler of a kingdom, as in the case was with King Bimbisara, and he would say, or King Pasenadi, does the king have sovereign rule over his kingdom? And the person says, of course. Absolutely. Yes. 100%. Yes. But then Lord Buddha starts picking on it carefully. Well, yeah, of course, he doesn't have 100% control. That's the usual response. Does he have control over his body? No. Does he have control over this? Does he have control over that? Da, 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 da. And the thing falls apart again and again and again. And the person understands this. So that's pretty much, in a very quick nutshell, that's what we can look at it as. And then Lord Buddha goes to the third aspect of the aggregates, which is sannyas. Bhikkhus, I like to translate it as mental associations rather than just mere perceptions. Bhikkhus, mental associations or sannyas in their essence are non-substantial. Because if mental associations were to have a substantiality to them, then they would not disintegrate or fall apart, where one could even be driven to say, may my mental associations be this way or that, substantial and unchanging. But because mental associations in their essence are non-substantial, they do disintegrate and fall apart, where one could not be able to say, may my mental associations be this way or that, substantial or unchanging. We can't change the nature of the world, but we can develop the capacity to become resilient despite the obstacles around us. And the reason why I say this is oftentimes we hold such a strong position vis-a-vis our own notions or mental associations, perceptions as to how the world is supposed to be, and those of others. So in this, what usually takes place are the defilements doing their thing. Defilements doing their thing, where we want to have someone else change their position, which pretty much explains the state of the world, right? Everybody wants to change somebody else's position to fit their own, especially when we look at the whole world as a unit. And because our own notions are in a state of flux. All of you today, all of us today sitting here, we used to have different associations of mentality, notions, concepts, beliefs, and they're always changing. And I mention this because many of us can get caught up in trying to fix someone else, remove their defilements. And that is not healthy, to say the least, because however bad their defilements might be, those defilements are not going to be taking us to hell. It's our defilements that will do the job, as Ajahn Mahabua would say. So focusing, bringing the attention back to us, to our own mental association, to our own perceptions is key, because oftentimes I notice we are too tightly bound by our concepts and perceptions. And here Lord Buddha is trying to separate the person from this also third khanda, because after all, we are the authors of our defilements. So the same goes with the sankharas in this case. So bhikkhus, mental habits or sankharas, I don't use the word formations or fabrications. I like to use either mental conjurings or mental habits for sankharas. So bhikkhus, mental habits or sankharas in their essence are non-substantial. Because if mental habits were to have a substantiality to them, then they would not disintegrate or fall apart. Where one could even be driven to say, may my mental habits be this way or that, substantial and unchanging. But bhikkhus, because mental habits in their essence are non-substantial, they do disintegrate and fall apart, where one could not be able to say, may my mental habits be this way or that, substantial or unchanging. I've seen on retreats where people want to attack their sankharas. Good luck. It's impossible. It's impossible to attack them. Nowhere in the suttas, Lord Buddha is saying, go ahead and attack the sankharas. Well, which one? It's vast. It's much vaster than the limitless amounts of lifetimes that we have lived in throughout samsara. It's quite an ego trip, in fact, to even think that we could manage to do this. But we can understand them. We can understand the mechanism behind it. And here we are using the technique that Lord Buddha is giving by first looking at these three characteristics. In each of these khandas can really grant us a unique point of view to see things differently, where we can have a role to play in the dismantling process. You know, it's very much like standing in the middle of a cave or on the edge of a wide valley, deep valley, and we let go of a cry. We yell, we sing, we make a sound that's loud enough. And suddenly we're going to hear the reverberations coming back to us. Oh, there's somebody over there. in the deep end of the cave or on the other side of the valley. But it's no more than an echo. Even a child knows this. So there's no person calling back to us from the end of the cave. But we like to think that there are, or there is, somebody in the valley calling back to us. So those are just the mere reverberations of our ideas, perceptions, notions, presumptions, papanchas, which we keep sending off, just like the voice that we let loose throughout the cave, which keeps coming back to us like the echo. So when we look at it, it starts to make more sense. But we have to have an approach that is coming from a place of discernment and not so much of an attachment as to what we think anicca is, for example. Because oftentimes we look at things in a non-personal way, almost like anicca is something I find somewhere. It's just like the Dhamma. I find it in the Sutta. It's there. Go look for it. Completely separate from my life. And that is not the way to know what suffering is. And what Lord Buddha is trying to say here, the way I understand it, is that as we're releasing that cry into the cave, it is suffering. And when it's coming back, it's also suffering when it comes back to us because of our identifications, because of our holding on to, this is how this relationship is supposed to go. Why are you changing in front of my eyes? Who told you to change? Who told you to become a different person? Sometimes we say this to ourselves. We can't fight back, but we also especially say it to the people or the world around us, and we get into this fight. In all cases, though, we're talking about suffering that is due to impermanence. Meanwhile, there's nobody else in the dark calling back to us, and that is anatta, non-substantiality. Bhikkhus, sense awareness, which is what usually is translated as consciousness for vijnana, bhikkhus, sense awareness in its essence is non-substantial, because if sense awareness were to have a substantiality to it, then it would not disintegrate or fall apart, where one could even be driven to say, may my sense awareness be this way or that, substantial and unchanging. In every living situation, in every experience, whether it's coming in through the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, we see that each of these senses are fighting, vying for our attention. Hey, look at me. Hey, I need to be the dominant one. Whether it's the taste buds, whether it's the ears, bringing in healthy ears, bringing the voice, the vibrations to the eardrum, processing all that. Every single one of them is trying to be the most predominant sense awareness or consciousness that is overwhelming our awareness, let's say, where we become cognizant of the world around us. So each of them is like wanting to become the dominant ambassador of the world, the dominant, the loudmouth of the moment, and where we can get to be pulled into the world, engaged more strongly with the world, basically becoming slaves to the world. That's why last week the question I think came up about restraint, sense restraint. What is that? Well, sense restraint, we apply it when we are noticing the mind being too laxed, unmindful, not present, completely unaware. There's no clear comprehension, no wise attention, where the person becomes a slave to these senses. Slaves. And that is what the world is always trying to have us become. And we have a modern term for it. We call it consumerism, to my understanding. And because all of these points of contact, that's what the sense doors are trying to do, anyhow, or are points of contact, points of impingement, if you like. They are trying to tease and tantalize us. It's like if you've ever seen the movie from the 70s and the early 80s, Star Wars, a classic. You know, you had the Death Star, and it had this gravitational pull that if any spaceship got too close to it, guess what? The Death Star would grab hold of it. It would override their system, and it would start to pull it in towards it, hold the inhabitants of the spaceship, the travelers, its own captive. They had no control. They couldn't pull away. The gravitational force was so strong, and that is what the six senses are trying to do. The vijnanas, sense awarenesses, whether it's a smell, whether it's a sound, whether it's a sight, and it could be either way. It could be unpleasant, meaning disgusting sight, something we call disgusting, or smell. And they have their own gradations depending on the experience. For example, a smell might be pretty bad just on its own, but try to put that smell into a food that you're eating, which is also bad tasting, which is also bad, just visually. So there are different gradations of how intensely they can overwhelm us. I use the word tantalize or tease. Well, overwhelming can also be good or bad. So they're always, each of these is always trying to capture always the spotlight, the main position. And what Lord Buddha is saying is, throughout the teachings, he's giving the key to unlock this mystery, to release us from this slavery, and that is yoniso manasikara. Wise attentiveness will cut the gravitational pull of the world, because the sense doors are also the doors of avidya. That's another way of looking at the sense doors. If there is no wise attentiveness or wise attention, yoniso manasikara, and that's why we need to constantly apply sati, apply it. That's the only way out of samsara. That's what Lord Buddha taught for 45 years. Don't become slaves to the senses. We can still use them. We can still be applying them and living in the world, but not of it. Remember that phrase? Well, that is applicable and doable thanks to yoniso manasikara. And Lord Buddha continues, but because sense awareness in its essence is non-substantial, it does disintegrate and fall apart, where one could not be able to say, may my sense awareness be this way or that, substantial or unchanging. Even if you are sitting on the most comfortable sofa, the most comfortable bed you're sleeping on, and you say, I'm never going to leave this place. It's perfect. Even if you're in the center of Bora Bora or somewhere that you love to be, let's say, imagine yourself in front of a waterfall in the middle of Costa Rican rainforest, covered up in this beautiful bungalow. Okay, 1 day passes, 2 day passes, 3 weeks pass. You're like, okay, my back is hurting. I need to go out and see what's over there on the other side of the world. All of a sudden, what was perceived as heavenly now becomes hellish, a terrible experience. Again, anicca, dukkha. Even though we were so identified with it, we were so atta with it, Lord Buddha saying, it was always anatta. So the person who, the sooner we realize this, the better. However, what this indicates is our attachment to the kileshas, the defilements that I was mentioning earlier. What are we taking refuge in? Like this morning, we took refuge again before we sat. Buddhaṃ saranam gacchāmi. I take refuge in the Buddha. Dhammam saranam gacchāmi. I take refuge in the Dhamma. Sangham saranam gacchāmi. I take refuge in the Sangha. But in reality, most of the time, we're actually doing, as Ajahn Ben would say, kilesham saranam gacchāmi. We're taking refuge in the kileshas. Honestly, I mean, look at your life. You're the expert at living your life. Is it truly a situation where it is Buddhaṃ saranam gacchāmi? Or is it kilesham saranam gacchāmi? So long as we are slaves to the sense doors, that's what we're doing. Slaves to our feelings, slaves to our bodies, slaves to what we are experiencing, sights. Oh, I don't want to look at that. I want to look more at things like this. I want to experience more things like that than this. I want to run away from this. So, meanwhile, the kileshas are just tossing and thrashing us around, about, all over the place. And there is no awareness that sati is not like just a course requirement, to be a stream runner, but it's something there to heal us from being tossed around. So it is for our own protection that we apply yoniso manasikara. It's the only way to eliminate suffering, Lord Buddha says. And this Dhamma is the only one that provides that. No other teaching does that. There were people who were reaching very high states of calm, tranquility. They were doing good deeds even before Lord Buddha showed up. Even when there was no sasana, there was no Buddhism, there were no Four Noble Truths. As far as the Dhamma is concerned, it was the Dark Ages for eons. But there were people who were doing good deeds. But you can do good deeds with tons of kileshas. There are many teachers out there in the world, some in robes, some are not, who are teaching good deeds. Be kind, be compassionate, be kind, be compassionate, do good deeds. Okay, then what else? That is lacking in Dhamma, pure and simple. Because there is no personality change taking place within the person. So this is the time period where we need to practice the Dhamma before it is completely gone. The teachings completely gone. And Lord Buddha's teachings are the only ones that can actually provide us with this exit. And I say this because of Samvega. We need to have the urgency to apply it while we're still alive, while we still have access, while we still have a body and a brain that can process these things, that can apply. What are the five aggregates? What is this whole business about anatta? What can I truly understand, etc.? So long as we have a body, we have everything. We have a brain that can process, we have everything we need. But we need to bring our part. We need to bring in, like Webu Sayadaw would say, this. We need to bring in the determination to make this, which is the only practice available that can do this, that can still do this, because even the Dhamma is so corrupt these days, so corrupt. But somehow we still are fortunate enough to still get this, the teachings that come to us through the Pali Suttas. But what do we do with them? Let us apply it more and more in our daily life. And here's where Lord Buddha goes into Q&A form of teaching. And you're going to see how he connects each of these form, etc., to the three characteristics of existence. He starts by saying, now, what do you think, bhikkhus? Would you say that form is permanent or impermanent? It is impermanent, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent be a cause for suffering or pleasure? A cause for suffering, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent, unstable, and a cause for suffering be looked upon as this is mine, this thing and I are one and the same, or that this is myself? No, Bhante, it could not. Here we see the beginning teaching modality of how to decipher or unravel, dissect, if you will, the paticca 12 links of causation. So here is where we see the equation, the formula. But of course, Lord Buddha is not getting into the paticca per se, but he's using the 5 aggregates, one at a time, as we're going to see, indicating that they're all dukkha. If there's impermanence, there's dukkha, there's suffering. Now, what do you think, bhikkhus? Would you say that feeling is permanent or impermanent? It is impermanent, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent be a cause for suffering or pleasure? A cause for suffering, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent, unstable, and a cause for suffering be looked upon as this is mine, this thing and I are one and the same, or that this is myself? Here, these three, this is who I am, this and I are one and the same, and this is myself. These are often called the 3 types of grasping or upadana. And the first one is etang mama, which is coming from this is mine, basically, and it comes from wrong view. And the first fetter that gets to be dropped in a person who has attained Sotapatti, someone who has seen with the Dhamma eye, is Sakkaya Ditti, the personality view, or the personality wrong view. And this statement of this is mine, etang mama, that is coming from wrong view. And the second one comes from craving. This thing and I are one and the same. Esohang asmi, which comes out of tanha, the craving or the thirst, the continued sense of thirst. And the third one, this is myself, is the third grasping. That comes from conceit or mana. Eso me attati, which is coming again from the sense of conceit. By the way, all these 3 graspings are necessary for there to be papanchas, mental proliferations, which we've talked about extensively in the past, especially when we covered the Madhupindika Sutta. So, but these are the 3 stampings that we use to look at our lives, basically. So impermanent things cause us pain. That's what Lord Buddha is saying, suffering. And whatever is conditioned, then it itself is impermanent. You put those conditions together, all of a sudden you have this. You take one of those conditions out, boom. In high school, I used to, whenever we did math problems, algebra, this and that, and then I would miss out a single, or I would misplace a single symbol, or the decimal point. That was a fun one. All of a sudden, all that effort that you put into that equation, the work that you were showing, and you know you have the answer correct, and the paper comes back and you didn't get the point. Why? Because there was one condition that was misplaced. In modern days, we have coding, let's say. If you do any software engineering and design, so you do apply codes for computer language. And if you misplace one single letter or number or whatever they use, the code doesn't do what it's supposed to. It does something else. So it's the same thing when we're looking at the impermanency of this conditional existence that we call life. And there isn't anything fixed or substantial about it. It's always morphing. It's always in motion. However, we want to have things be fixed, and that is the thing which is causing us suffering. So there needs to be an understanding of the relationship between the suffering and its origin. And this takes us back to the first sutta that the Dhammacakkappavattana, the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, where we saw the Four Noble Truths. This is following along the same path that was started. So we saw the relationship between suffering and its origin, its causes, and which are no more than our attachment to things. The thirst, the drive to change what is happening in front of us, which for whatever reason we cannot tolerate. Now, what do you think, bhikkhus? Would you say that mental associations are permanent or impermanent? They are impermanent, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent be a cause for suffering or pleasure? A cause for suffering, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent, unstable, and a cause for suffering be looked upon as this is mine, this thing and I are one and the same, or that this is myself? No, Bhante, it could not. Concepts, notions, perceptions that we like, we hoard them. We keep them in. We keep them close to us. Those that we don't like, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Even if they were part and parcel of who we were, of how we thought. And this falls in line with what I was mentioning earlier about defilements that we identify in others, where we want to go outside and fix the world around us by changing the way that other people think. What we're trying to do is basically to reduce our suffering. But it is only when that sense of displeasure or pain is no more that we get some relief. Whether the world changes or not, whether that person over there, your boss, your supervisor, your colleague, changes and becomes a better person or not, it really should not, based on this teaching, affect us in gaining that sense of tranquility and contentment. So, because ultimately pleasure and pain are two sides of the same coin. We can't have one without the other. And the same goes with impermanence and suffering. So long as things are impermanent, there will be suffering. Just knowing that much is actually protecting us tremendously. Because it shows us the transitoriness of the you cannot count basically on impermanence. And now, what do you think, bhikkhus? Would you say that mental habits are permanent or impermanent? They are impermanent, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent be a cause for suffering or pleasure? A cause for suffering, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent, unstable, and a cause for suffering be looked upon as this is mine, this thing and I are one and the same, or that this is myself? No, Bhante, it could not. We've been growing old, even from the time that we sat today to this hearing me speak, we're getting older, we're decaying. We die to experiences. Relationships are coming and going. Things are dropping away constantly, ever since of our birth, in fact. The best example that comes to mind, in fact, is our umbilical cord. When we were born, a portion of the umbilical was left for most of us on the body. And I remember when my younger brother was born, I noticed, I was old enough to understand, but I said, "Mom, what is that?" Asking my mom about whenever she changed him. And she would tell me that's the umbilical. But what is that? It looks ugly. It looks this, it's that. And then she would say, "Don't look at that. But it'll fall off." I said, "How could that fall off? It's part of him." Until one day it did fall off, just like it had fallen off of me and everyone else. Things have been dropping away from us, from physically our bodies. So if we don't believe in impermanence or non-substantiality, that's a perfect example. If we don't believe about the hair, then we don't want to see it, rather. That was the last remnant, a physical reminder of our journey inside our mother's womb. And ever since then, countless pounds of skin cells, hair, nails, head hairs, all kinds of cells have been falling off of our bodies ceaselessly. But we like to have this sense of continuity, this sense of unchanging character about us, even though everything, including our concepts, are changing. Now, what do you think, bhikkhus? Would you say that sense awareness is permanent and impermanent? It is impermanent, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent be a cause for suffering or pleasure? A cause for suffering, Bhante. And could that which is impermanent, unstable, and a cause for suffering be looked upon as, this is mine, this thing and I are one and the same, or that this is myself? No, Bhante, it could not. In this manner, bhikkhus, whenever you encounter any kind of forms whatsoever, whether it may be from the past, present, or future, whether witnessed internally or externally, whether of a gross or subtle nature, whether being of an inferior or superior quality, all these you must look upon as they truly are in reality, and with the correct understanding thus: this is not mine, this thing and I are not one and the same, this is not myself. Similarly, bhikkhus, whenever you encounter any kind of feelings whatsoever, whether it may be from the past, present, or future, whether witnessed internally or externally, whether of a gross or subtle nature, whether being of an inferior or superior quality, all these you must look upon as they truly are in reality, and with the correct understanding thus: this is not mine, this thing and I are not one and the same, this is not myself. But it's important for us not to pay it lip service, just like I was mentioning about the taking of the refuge. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasam, or specifically, Buddhang saranang gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha. Am I paying lip service when in fact what I'm saying is kileshang saranang gacchami? Same thing when we're saying, this is not mine, this thing and I are not one and the same, this is not myself. This is not some mantra that we can say repeatedly on a superficial level while the heart is going on a different journey altogether, opposite to this direction. Similarly, bhikkhus, whenever you encounter any kind of mental associations whatsoever, whether they may be from the past, present, or future, whether witnessed internally or externally, whether of a gross or subtle nature, whether being of an inferior or superior quality. All these you must look upon as they truly are in reality, and with the correct understanding. Thus, this is not mine. This thing and I are not one and the same. This is not myself. I noticed some encounters I've had over the years that we have a tendency to intellectualize things, especially where many of us come from a thinking background, in a sense, where things have to make sense conceptually. We try to similarly attempt at figuring out anatta intellectually, understanding the Four Noble Truths intellectually. But I get it. Like the people say, I get it. I understand the Four Noble Truths. That's not it, though. Yes, it's necessary because it's part of pariyatti, of the studying part. It allows us to remember, to recall to mind, to keep it in the heart, and just like, okay, let me replay that tape in my head. Four Noble Truths: suffering, origin of suffering, nirodha, cessation, and then the path. Okay, what's the path about? Oh, okay, yeah, right view. Okay, let's start with that. Does this thing that I'm doing have right view in it? That is application, turning that intellect-based knowledge, basically, into something that is valid and pertinent to your life, to your living experience. But that requires constant monitoring, constant observation from us, where we become aware of seeing what is happening, discerning what is happening, what is taking place, and how essentially we are contributing to our own suffering, ultimately. And that is what the whole point of sati sampajanya is, the way I see it. Why do we become mindful and clearly comprehending of what? What is it? The table that's there, the computer, this? No. We're becoming mindful and comprehending clearly of our contribution to this whole perpetuation of suffering. Is there, or are there papanchas playing in my intention here to do this? Which also indicates the presence of, if there are papanchas, there are wrong views there. So intellect is not to be shunned at all. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's necessary. The reasoning, the rationality, all of that is necessary, but they by themselves are nothing. This is an application-based practice. So the listener to this sutta must need to have a strong foundation in both understanding intellectually and application of it. In addition, like I was mentioning earlier, this is not just awakening is not going to happen simply by intellectually understanding. It also needs practice, yes, but what kind of practice? It needs both samadhi and vipassana. Both have to be there. Samadhi is the mental calm practice through the jhanas, as well as the vipassana, which is the insight that needs to be happening, the insights that need to be constantly happening. And the insight can only happen when the mind is discerning throughout the different phases of a life that the person is going through. So it's very engaging. It's very engaging. Otherwise, anyone who rationally gets it, gets the teachings, could basically call themselves an arahant. Yeah, which can be quite comical. Similarly, bhikkhus, whenever you encounter any kind of mental habits whatsoever, sankharas, whether they may be from the past, present, or future, whether witnessed internally or externally, whether of a gross or subtle nature, whether being of an inferior or superior quality. All these you must look upon as they truly are in reality, and with the correct understanding thus: this is not mine, this thing and I are not one and the same, this is not myself. This is crucial to have when we some of us find ourselves in constant, like the dog chasing its own tail type of a situation, where we see that we have a habitual tendency to do something that we don't necessarily like about ourselves, but we constantly do it and we identify with it. People dealing with addictions, people dealing with toxic tendencies, where they self-sabotage, or individuals having experienced trauma, where they always have this self-disparaging inner talker, the nagging voice, I call it, or the imposter syndrome is another one. I'm not good enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. That's all from sankharas, either from this life or from previous lives. I'm not going to go after them. Even today's modern trauma researchers say, don't try to get rid of the trauma. You can't. It's done. So even today's today's psychotherapists are saying that. So why should I even bother? Okay, but I can look at my relationship with it. And that's what they are also saying, by the way. It took them about 2,600 years to get to this point, what Lord Buddha explained. You can't change the trauma. You can change the relationship you have with the trauma, with the addiction, with the negative habitual pattern. And that requires us to somewhat distance ourselves from it as this is mine. You and I are one and the same. That erroneous approach, wrong view, miccāditthi, wrong view, is what we're looking at. But it needs constant checking and rechecking and checking and rechecking so that we see, with the help of sati, with the help of clearly comprehending, using our meditation object wisely to bring it into our daily life so we can see these glued identifications and see, no. This is just something that I had the tendency of doing. I am not it. It is not me. So you can play around with the words so long as you can anthropomorphize it, if you will, bring it more into some type of a relatability, having a flavor of that, where you can identify it as something that I'm identifying with, if that makes sense. Words fail after some time. As you can see, I'm struggling with my words. Similarly, bhikkhus, whenever you encounter any kind of sense awareness whatsoever, vijnana, whether it may be from the past, present, or future, whether witnessed internally or externally, whether of a gross or subtle nature, whether being of an inferior or superior quality, all these you must look upon as they truly are in reality, and with the correct understanding thus: this is not mine. This thing and I are not one and the same. This is not myself. And if you notice, it says whether if it's of an inferior or superior quality. Many people get stuck on wanting to have a certain jhanic experience happen, or a certain insight to reoccur, or how come I'm not able to reach that state of contentment that I did? And every sit that they have, every time they try to meditate, they are trying to recapture that. And that is such an unfair thing to do to themselves. So as teachers, we have to disconnect them from such a wrong view. Because here we see Lord Buddha saying that is also part of anatta. You have no control over that. And this is a hard lesson for many students, because they just were able to get to the first jhana, and now they know that there's more stuff to experience. They want to experience the second one. But the colors that they're using, the color palette that they're using is coming straight from the first jhanic experience, which, by the way, they had no clue prior to it happening. No clue prior to it occurring. But now they're using that to figure out what's coming up next, which is completely wrong view. So that is where the person has to allow themselves that openness, allow themselves to just be present and with a beginner's mind, because ultimately it is independent of them wanting certain outcomes. What they can do is they can create the right conditions, of course. But other than that, you have to pull your hands away and allow it to happen, whatever is supposed to happen. So there needs to be that sense of humility, approaching it like that. So as you see, this sutta is taught to dismantle our concepts, our conceptions about ourselves, about life, about what is happening to us, and the constant longing after things that we have. So this is addressing in a way, it's an antidote that is addressing the disease in the heart that is always striving, trying to reject life. That's another way of looking at it. Rejection of life, of what is taking place, good or bad. Whatever is happening in front of us, in us, to our ideas, to our attachments. So this sutta is an antidote to that. And the closest evidence, or the closest way, the quickest way that we can apply this antidote is by looking at our attachment to this body. How I would like my body to not fall apart so quickly, at least give me an extra 40, 50, 60 years, or until I send you a note and saying, now it's time, it's okay for you to get old. So it is about having us challenge our identifications on a moment-to-moment basis by bringing to mind the principles covered in this sutta. So, like everything else throughout the teachings of Lord Buddha, here also in the sutta, we see how Lord Buddha so lovingly tries to cure the sickness, this disease of the heart, by sharing this understanding, his wisdom with the bhikkhus that had been suffering, even as sotapannas, because so long as we are not arahants yet, we are suffering. Yes, of course, much less. As a sotapanna, you would be suffering much less than the putujjanas, but still there is suffering going on. So he's trying to ameliorate the situation by removing the sickness of rejecting the truth of each moment that is taking place, the sickness of each moment where we want to go ahead and reject what is taking place, that opposition, if you will, the refusal to see that there's nothing worth grabbing onto, all kinds of identifications. And every day there's a new identification. Oh, I need you to identify me this way. I need you to identify me that way. Or I identify you this way. All these crazy identifications get us more and more into the solidifying concrete of ignorance, when the whole purpose of awakening is the opposite, in the opposite direction, away from these identifications. So the sooner we see that, the sooner our suffering will disappear. So, continuing on. By seeing in this manner, bhikkhus, the noble disciple in training by the way, the noble disciple in training is someone who has seen with the Dhammai, meaning there is Sotapanna or a Sakadagamin or even an Anagami. These are primarily the disciples in training. When a person becomes an arahant, especially an arahant with phala or fruition, they're no longer in training. They're called aseika, beyond training. So when we hear that noble disciple in training, we're talking about a noble disciple, somebody who belongs, who is considered as experiencing nibbana on one of these levels, but not an arahant. The noble disciple in training becomes naturally pulled away and disenchanted from all kinds of forms, disenchanted from all kinds of feelings, disenchanted from all kinds of mental associations, notions, concepts, disenchanted from all kinds of mental habits, sankharas, and disenchanted from all kinds of sense awareness, vijnana. Being thus pulled away and disenchanted from all these, he becomes dispassionate. And as a result of his dispassion, his mind is freed and his heart released. Being thus released, there arises within him direct knowledge and understanding, as he knows for the first time. It is now finally liberated. Let us note here that how there is no reference of a self. It says, it is now liberated. In Pali, the term is vimuttisming vimuttang iti jnanam hoti. And with this experience, the sutta continues, he fully comprehends. Now, birth is finally destroyed. The holy life has been fully lived. What had to be done is now done and finished. There is no further coming to any state of re-becoming. This is what the Blessed One said. And in hearing the words of the Blessed One, the group of 5 bhikkhus rejoiced in their hearts. For while this discourse was being taught by the Tathagata, the hearts of all 5 bhikkhus, through no longer grasping onto anything, suddenly were released from the contaminants completely. And now there were 6 arahants living in the world. As mentioned, this took place on the 5th day after the Lord Buddha turned the wheel of Dhamma in motion. So you have now 5 additional arahants. I think here I included it from the last sentence. I included from the Mahavagga, which is from the Vinaya. I thought it was just beautiful to have that be there in the sutta itself. And so here is where we see the sasana, or Buddhism as such, being established for the first time. Because now you had Sangha. And a Sangha that was Mahasangha. When we use the word Maha, obviously it comes from Sanskrit, and in Pali it's the same. It means great, great Sangha. It is not the collection of number of people, basically 5, 10, 20, 500. That doesn't mean that is a Maha Sangha, even though many places that's how many people translate it as. Unfortunately, that is completely wrong. Because when we say Mahasangha, what we're referring to are those individuals who have attained any of the stages of awakening, whether they're noble disciples or arahants. So that is what makes the Sangha Maha. So this is an effort that needs to go beyond mere intellectual endeavor. Um, or it's not the accumulation of some didactic reasoning or rationally figuring things out, um, using the information in front of us to figure it out. That's not it. That's part of it. We need a foundation of understanding, but we need to take it into practice. And so the mind must be prepared first through wise attentiveness and with wise firmness of exertion. And that includes sati and sampajanya. That includes samvega, the sense of urgency. That definitely includes the driving force, which is aditana. When you get up and you don't feel like, or something happens to you and you say, no, I'm just going to lay low and not be involved in any of this work of being mindful or of heedfulness. Instead, we need to constantly apply ourselves to what was listened to and learned and kept in the heart, and bringing that into the meditation practice where it all comes together. So I will pause here and thank you for listening and sharing of these gems with you. So if there's any, there are any questions and comments, please unmute yourself and this was one of the toughest suttas in my journey through the studying of the Dhamma in this life, of how I have always been intimidated by it, because I guess it had to do with Venerable Kondanya going from a Sotapanna straight to Arahant. Not just him, all of them, all five became Arahants. So I was always like, oh, I have to understand, I have to apply, and then, oh, so you kind of put it over there, and it's almost like an untouchable sutta, which comes from my own delusion, of course, ignorance, and we need to overcome those and look at our own relationship to that, because oftentimes we shun certain things because of our attachment to how we want to see things to be in the first place, meaning my identification with my own concepts and expectations. So, which also is one of the biggest hindrance in our practice, because we don't want to relinquish what was experienced yesterday. We don't want to let go of the mental calm, or we want to repeat it. And we're not so open to possibilities of whatever happens to happen, which is the reason why we were at that state of allowing that, let's say if we're talking about jhanas, that jhana occurred. You were completely available, allowing that state of mind took place. So that is what needs to be brought into the scene. More of that permissive allowing of, I'm trusting you, I'm trusting the process. And that is something you can definitely take refuge in also. When we take refuge in the Triple Gem, what are we doing? We're taking refuge in not the historical Buddha who lived and died 2,600 years ago almost, but the potential of that awakening to also happen within me here, now, in the 21st century, in the middle of this chaos, it could still happen. Oh, can I trust that? Trusting in my goodness. Sometimes we use that term. Can I trust that? Why not? If there are no questions, I think we're going to end sooner than normally.
Thanks very much, Bhante.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that in many ways, this sutta and the previous sutta that we have discussed, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, are closely related to a few other suttas, namely the first sutta in the Majjhima Nikāya, the Mulapariyaya Sutta, and one of the last suttas in the same Majjhima Nikāya, the Chacaka Sutta, and even, for example, the I think it's the second sutta in the Digha Nikāya, the Samanaphala Sutta. But the difference is probably in the details. Whereby the Mulapariyaya Sutta, the Chacaka Sutta, probably has much more elaborations, much more explanations, into the details, which are succinctly summarized by in this particular sutta, and also especially the Bahiya Sutta.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that we all arrive at the same conclusion, but probably speaking for myself, I think I find the details more digestible than what I am experiencing now.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. This is where we have the foundation. These primary few suttas. Foundation of what? Foundation of the sasana, in fact. That's, the Dhammacakkappavattana, Anattalakkhaṇa Sutta, Hemavata Sutta, and Aditya Pariyaya Sutta. These four that we'll be covering. The next one, I think, will be the Aditya Pariyaya. Actually, probably the Hemavata, which I have to still translate. That comes from the Sutta Nipata, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, set of suttas of all of the Nikayas that were around even at the time of the Buddha. So the bhikkhus would memorize and chant or recite them in the presence of Lord Buddha. So coming back straight to your question, we have to look at who the crowd was, if you will, who the audience was here. These five were individuals who have lived together along with Lord Buddha as Siddhartha in the past, which now Lord Buddha had full access to their minds and their capacities, given the power of the Buddha. And he saw the ability, he saw what nuances, he saw what tweakings are necessary. And as a teacher, one thing that makes a teacher, better teacher than someone else, let's say, is their ability to identify what needs to be said, when and how, and in what manner, so that they could get the best result, best outcome for the student, understanding the main message of the teaching so that they can improve their learning, or in this case, attain the highest attainment that a being could have, which is arahantship. And there's also the presence of pride among the five. That's also there. There's a presence of conceit because they were still latching on. Even though they had accepted, there is still pride. I mean, Sotapannas, yes, they have dropped those three fetters, but there's still delusion. There's still ignorance. There's still conceit, in fact. I know better, including towards one's own teacher. In this case, Lord Buddha, because they were still struggling with the, wait a minute, weren't you that same guy that was, with us for 6 years? Yeah, you're talking differently. Yes, your mannerisms are different. Yeah. There is still that stain in the mind. So Lord Buddha had to approach, this is, of course, my own way of understanding the sutta. Other teachers, other individuals, other practitioners might have a different view on this. But approaching the three graspings, this is mine, this and I are not one and the same, or this is myself. By him looking at that and really shedding a light on that, instead of, let's say, going into, for example, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta from the Majjhima Nikāya, which goes into in-depth 6 sets of 6 analysis, deep, continuous. It's almost like repetitive. It's not almost, it's very repetitive, but it's like hammering a nail in continuously, or using those 2 dry pieces of wood continuously to create that fire, that spark. Because Lord Buddha didn't cover it here, again, this is what has remained through centuries and reached us, thankfully, at least this portion. We didn't have a recording device, so to record exactly what was said, but this is what we have of that encounter between Lord Buddha and his students, the 5. So the simplest way of delivery was this. Now later on we see the other suttas. Dumula Pariyaya, why, what was the root of it all? How did it happen? Or Samanyapala, or how Samanapala, the recluseship, the different aspects of it. What led to this? The holy life, where Lord Buddha goes into details, how he suffered, for example, as a self-mortifying ascetic. And then he goes into details about the practice. Well, these people are already experts at self-mortification. They're expert of that one extreme. Lord Buddha was an expert at both. And he was helping them by using a language that was common to both himself and to them. So there was this sense of relatedness. And perhaps there was also a lot of intellectual understanding as well. Because remember, these 5 were Brahmin. And Venerable Kondanya, he himself was a prodigy, and he knew the Vedas very well. And he was also a samana now for years. And the other 4 were also children of Brahmin class. Brahmins, the seers, the rishis that had come to identify Siddhartha when he was a baby. So they were very rich with knowledge and intellect. So Lord Buddha didn't want to waste time, and his point was to get the person from A to Z as quickly as possible, which I love. He does not waste time. He does not waste time. Now, of course, it has everything to do with the student being ready. So if the student has a lot more dust, the layer of dust in their eyes, as they say, in, with Brahma Sampati's reference. If it's too thick, then the teacher has to go probing more. He has to say a lot more. That's why Lord Buddha didn't like it when a student came with too many questions. In fact, right before his, in Mahaparinibbana Sutta, there's one person who used to come and ask questions and he would always go away. And he had done this for years. He would just love engaging in conversations, and it's like, oh boy, again he came. That's what Venerable Ananda saw this person approach, and is like, oh, you again? The master is about to die. He's about to breathe his last breath, and you're here to ask him questions. But that day, that moment, that evening, that person had come because he had realized the futility of all those questions, of him being the argumentative type. He had come simply to become a bhikkhu, and not only that, obviously, to become an arahant. He knew this was my chance, and he approaches. But then Lord Buddha sees with his mind, because Venerable Ananda is arguing with this gentleman, saying, no, we don't, Lord Buddha doesn't have time for you, for the likes of you. Lord Buddha sees with his mind, the mind of this person who has come in. I forgot his name, Sudatta? I could be wrong. And he sees that he's ready. He sees that he's ready. He's not going to go into Chacakka Sutta. He's not going to go into any of the other in-depth suttas to analyze the 5 aggregates. None of that. He just needed a morsel of wisdom, just tiny little bit, just a nudge. And he came. Lord Buddha gives him that, and in fact, he gives him also the upasampada. He gives him the ordination right there. And that person, that night, becomes an arahant. And that person was the last person who attained while Lord Buddha was alive. Attained arahantship. And he was also the last person who was ordained by Lord Buddha prior to dying. So the student's capacity is very important. As in any area of pedagogy or teaching, education, the student's level has to be extremely, well, it needs to be brought into the equation when we're looking at the suttas. The best example is the one that you gave of the Bahya Sutta. That's why Bahya was recognized by Lord Buddha as the foremost out of the 80 students, who was the quickest in attaining with the shortest of teachings. What does that say? Was it with the teaching itself? Or was it more having to do with the level of preparedness that was done? Was the soil cultivated? Was it fertile enough? And there's obviously, so many aspects to that. The merits have to be there. Obviously the person has to have the ability to think. They also have to have the calmness of mind and the level of understanding. So in the case of Bahya, if you recall, he was one of those group of 7 bhikkhus who had gone up in a previous, I believe it was Padumuttara or Kassapa Buddha's time, up this cliff, and they kicked away the ladder from civilization to connected them to civilization. And he was one of those bhikkhus who died on that rock face without having attained. But his adhitthana was impeccable. He died trying. That doesn't disappear with the person. So that is what Bahya had. So the student was ready. So sometimes it's just a tiny little touch, and then everything is different. So in this case, yes, it's not Bahya Sutta. It's a lot more detailed than Bahya Sutta, of course. But it's a lot less in content than, let's say, the other suttas you mentioned. So we have to look at the contexts of what is taking place, who is listening. These were superlative meditators, the five, top level meditators, and their level of dedication was impeccable, and Lord Buddha knew that, and he had lived with them. But when we recite or read the Chaccaka Sutta, or even suttas like, Sammaditthi Sutta that Venerable Sariputta gave to his fellow bhikkhus, you don't have everybody in the crowd being on that level of dedication or of practice. That's why Venerable Sariputta, for example, has to go through so many different layers of what is right view and breaking it down, unraveling, spoon feeding, if you will, the tiniest little, the biggest context, concepts, the tiniest concepts, etc., using different references and similes. So the timing, the level of the student's capacity to understand are two very important. They're not the only important criteria, but they are very, very key ingredients in the whole equation of why a sutta was more elaborate, in depth than another. How is that? Do you feel like that was satisfactory? The answer I gave you?
Yes, definitely. It makes a lot of sense to me, Bhante. Thanks very much. And as I recollect, I think the very first persons to appear on the Buddha's mind after he gained enlightenment was his previous teachers, Anattalakkhaṇa and Uddaka Ramaputta.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the first persons whom he probably think would gain enlightenment immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Were he to give them a desana, but unfortunately they were already dead.
Yes, and that is. If there's anything sad, I call that an example of sadness, or terrible, because a missed opportunity, a perfect example of a missed opportunity, where you had these two highly evolved or highly, superlative again, meditators, teachers of that time period in all of humanity. And they're that close, they're born at the time of the Buddha. In fact, they taught him as Siddhartha. And yes, they were the first two that came to mind. Once Brahma Sahampati convinced Lord Buddha to teach, and he left. He looked, who would be able to absorb the Dhamma beautifully? Whose soil is ready to absorb it quickly? And both of those teachers came up. Unfortunately, one had died 7 days earlier, and the other one had died just the night prior. And the next time that they will come out of those realms, one is reborn because of their high jhanic one-pointedness of concentration and their intentionality behind where to go next. When they died, one reappeared in the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, where there's no perception as such of anything, of mind even. Otherwise, Lord Buddha could have communicated the Dhamma from mind to mind, but that's not possible. And that is 84,000 Mahakalpas to spend there. What a life sentence. Even though it's like the highest sublime state, if you want to call it. That's what they were aiming for. That's what many people aim for to this day in parts of the world when they do some yogic practice, including in the Dhamma. And the other one had died and gone to the realm of nothingness, which has 60,000 Mahakalpas. Again, who knows when they come back? Hopefully they will come back. You know, there is the reference made in regards to Devadatta. Devadatta, Lord Buddha's own brother-in-law, cousin, who had tried to kill the Lord Buddha several times, despite the fact that he had such evil intentions, and despite the fact that he is in some of the worst parts of the hell realms, and he's going to be there for a long time. Lord Buddha nevertheless said that Devadatta will one day even be able to attain arahantship. I believe attaining Pacceka Buddha status, who basically cannot have any students, cannot teach it. They can experience it, but they can't teach it. So if a Devadatta, a character like that, can have, because he also had merits after all. He met the Buddha. He took ordination. Lord Buddha was his upajjhaya, his preceptor. I mean, come on. They played together as children. He experienced the jhanas. Well, a portion of the jhanas, up until the fourth jhana. He heard Lord Buddha teach. So that says a lot. The other two teachers never got that chance. So Devadatta had many more chances that, of course, he didn't make much use of, because he was gone in conceit, and he lost all those jhanas. Because the moment you go against the sasana, the moment you go against the Dhamma, whatever attainments you had slip from you immediately. You cannot have them. There's no way that you can get into any jhana or any meditative absorption, for that matter. So that's what had happened to Devadatta. So without digressing too much, I am hopeful that those two teachers will be able to come back to a realm where they can be exposed to a Dhamma from a future Buddha long after we're gone. So, yeah. Good question. Appreciate it. Any other thoughts, comments, questions before we close? Okay. Let's share some merits. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find health relief. May all beings share in these merits that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of wholesome happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share in these merits of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you be well. May the triple gem bless you. And may every time you take refuge not be those of the kileshas. And may it be always, not just once in a day, earlier in the day. See you next week.